There is a highway in British Columbia, Canada called Highway 16. But there is a strip of it that some people refer to as the Highway of Tears. Why? Well, across the 450 miles long highway, there have unfortunately been over 80 murders and disappearances in the past 60 years. For years, for some people, getting from point A to point B wasn't a convenience, it was a risk. Along this stretch of road, women, disproportionately indigenous women and girls, went missing. Some were later found murdered. Many were never found at all. When you talk about Highway 16, you can't reduce it to a serial killer story. No. You have to understand the history and the inequalities that propelled this dark piece of Canada forward. You see, though it may be a little uncommon nowadays, people used to hitchhike a lot back in the 70s and 80s. Nowadays, if your favorite YouTuber hitchhikes across America, you'd be fascinated. But back then, it wasn't seen as a reckless choice. With limited means of transportation, people did what they had to do to get to school, work, appointments, to other members of family. The Highway of Tears refers to the corridor of Highway 16, the Yellowhead, between Prince George and Prince Rupert. The name became widely used after a 1998 vigil in the region, where the grief of families was described as tears tied to the road. After multiple years of carelessness, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, the Canadian equivalent of the FBI, eventually created a task force focused on a defined set of cases with strict criteria amongst the countless missing persons across Highway 16. But unfortunately, the government of Canada has been implicated by some in the controversy, as many families and advocates, however, believe that number is incredibly smaller than reality. Before we talk about police files, task forces, and theories, we have to start with the victims, the long list of names that families never wanted to memorize. You'll notice something right away. Many of the victims were young. Many were indigenous. Many vanished during the most ordinary moments of life. Unfortunately, because of the time constraints, this is not going to be a roll call, but I'm going to tell you a few stories that show the pattern and why this highway became so feared. The first victim we're going to focus on is called Nicole Hoare. She was a 25-year-old from Alberta, working as a tree planter in the Prince George area during the summer. On June 21st, 2002, she set out to hitchhike west on Highway 16 towards Smithers, a trip people made all the time. She was last seen that same afternoon in the Prince George area, and then nothing. The days that followed were a blur of posters, calls, and reported sightings, hundreds of them. The kind that gives a family hope and exhaustion at the same time. Police conducted searches and continued to revisit leads over the years, but her disappearance remains unsolved. Nicole's case later became one of the investigations under Project EPANA, created to focus on a defined set of missing and murdered women cases linked to this corridor. Another victim, Tamara Lynn Chipman, was 22 when she disappeared on September 21st, 2005. Reports place her last known movements in the Prince Rupert area, where she was believed to be hitchhiking, the same last step that shows up again and again in these cases. Her home community is often described as Morristown First Nation. Her disappearance is devastating, partly because it's so ordinary at the start. You're trying to get somewhere, you don't have a ride, you do what people around you have done for years, and then she's gone, leaving a family trapped in the worst kind of limbo. No answers, no certainty, and no closure. In December 1974, Monica Ignis was last seen walking along Highway 16 near Thornhill. Months later, her body was found a few kilometers from where she had disappeared. Decades have passed, and the case remains, again, unsolved. This is what makes the Highway of Tears so hard to sit with. Time doesn't seem to close the wound, it just spreads it across generations. Monica's story is one of the earlier cases often discussed in the corridor's history, and it highlights how long families have been waiting for real answers. Eventually, after trying to save their image and put aside their systemic racism, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police created a task force called Project Ipana, as mentioned before. You have to understand, this task force was launched in 2005, nearly 35 years after the first mysterious disappearance across the Highway of Tears. Its central question and main objective was to determine whether there is a serial killer targeting women along these highways. 2 years later, by 2007, the task force had expanded to 18 cases, 13 homicide investigations, and 5 missing person investigations. There are multiple controversial parts to this investigation, namely the time it took for the Canadian government to set up a task force, but also the set of criteria that were defined in order for a Highway 16 case to be included in the task force. Victims had to have been female victims hitchhiking with last known locations near Highway 16. Tears re-emerged as families who had lost their closed ones in the past 3 decades were outraged when the state did not appropriately give them mental peace by including their family member's name in the list of the task force. But, and I bet you've had this question all along, why Highway 16? What is so particular about this strip of land that made it become a murderous hallmark in Canada? Why not another highway? It's reiterating what communities across the road were saying for decades. If people have absolutely no safe way to travel, they'll end up on the shoulder of the highway, which creates perfect conditions for predators. The answer to the question is that Highway 16 is at the intersection of isolation and opportunity. Isolated enough that a person can disappear between communities with a few witnesses at most, and opportunistic enough that strangers constantly pass through. Huge stretches of Highway 16 are made up of dense forests with limited lighting and long gaps where someone can pull over, pick someone up, and be gone in seconds. Another crucial element that contributes to the story of Highway 16 is the cellular coverage. You see, because of its location, being at the literal end of the world, over 80% of the highway had absolutely no cellular telephone service up until December 2024, when the company Rogers installed 5G cell towers across the strip. Layered on top of all of this is the part that Canada has to face and has failed to face before. The victims were disproportionately Indigenous women and girls, living with the consequences of intergenerational trauma, characterized by non-exhaustively poverty, displacement, and systemic neglect. Meaning the danger wasn't just manufactured by predators, it was enabled and propelled by the conditions surrounding the highway. Years later, British Columbia announced, nearly 50 years after the beginning of the events, that they would pump funding into improving the transit connections along Highway 16 as part of a broader transportation action plan. Even the police forces have stated and admitted that they were extremely confident that a single killer is not responsible for all cases connected to the Highway of Tears investigations. So if you came looking for one name that explains everything, this isn't that kind of story. Nonetheless, there have been major developments, including cases where evidence points to specific offenders. Bobby Jack Fowler was a US offender who died in prison in 2006. In September 2012, investigators publicly tied Fowler to the 1974 murder of Colleen Macmillan through DNA evidence announced in the context of Ipana's Highway of Tears work. Reported investigators considered him strongly suspected in other 1970s era cases in BC, and Fowler is important in the story because he proved something terrifying. At least one predatory offender was moving through these routes decades ago, and could remain invisible until DNA technology caught up. Another well-known suspect in the cases of the Highway 16 murders is Gary Taylor Handlin. Handlin is often mentioned in the broader BC highway corridor narrative because his case shows how long delayed justice can look. In 2019, he was sentenced to life in prison for the first-degree murder of Monica Jack, a 12-year-old girl who disappeared in 1978. The third suspect is amongst the most cold-blooded murderers of Canada's history, Cody Lejbakov. The most chilling and horrifying part of his story is that it destroys the comforting idea that was the 70s. His murders occurred between 2009 and 2010 in modern times near Prince George. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police described the start of the case on a remote BC highway in late November 2010. An officer stops a then 20-year-old after his truck emerges from a logging road and speeds away. And that stop kicks off the investigation that ultimately leads to convictions. Lejbakov was convicted in 2014 of 4 counts of first-degree murder. Unfortunately, the body of Natasha Montgomery, one of the victims of Mr. Lejbakov, has never been recovered despite searches. To conclude the video, I must say if this story leaves you unsettled, it should. This isn't a mythical story with a feels-good Disney-like ending, and it isn't true crime entertainment. It's a real strip of land where the darkest and most profoundly disturbed aspects of man were manifested. So when people ask, was there a killer on the Highway of Tears? The honest answer is, there were killers. There were suspects. There were convictions. But unfortunately, there were and still are families waiting for answers because too many of the cases remain unsolved.